Oh, hey, looky what I just got in the mail. Looks like an instruction manual for how to evangelize unbelievers like us. Let's see what it has to say. Hey there, folks. Bertram, the Barely Bearable Atheist here, and it's time to start a new series. This time our subject is the book Tactics by Greg Koukl, and let me tell you, it's a relief to have a title that ain't 25 words long for a change. The cover says this is the 10th anniversary edition, and the introductory preface is entitled, quote, Preface to the 2nd edition, so I assume them two's the same thing. Published in 2019 by the Zondervan Publishing Company, Tactics promises to be, quote, a game plan for discussing your Christian convictions, end quote. Kind of reminds me of the book How to Give Away Your Faith by Paul Little that I remember from my InterVarsity days years ago. But I digress. Koukl is a Christian apologist and founder of the Stand to Reason Apologetics Ministry, which describes itself as, quote, a ministry that equips Christians to think clearly and confidently about their faith, end quote. So unlike a lot of other ministries, they don't target unbelievers directly, or at least that ain't their emphasis. They's targeting believers and trying to turn believers into apologists and evangelists. Just what we need. The content of the book starts with a preface by Lee Stroebel talking about a time when he hosted a debate between Greg Koukl and Deepak Chopra, which probably would have been a sight to see. Quote, Greg was simply so engaging and so effective in poking holes in Chopra's worldview that I had to keep the cameras running. Time after time, Greg was able to expose the faulty thinking underlying Chopra's amorphous theology and correct his inaccurate claims about Jesus and the Bible. Before I knew it, we had consumed the entire hour of the show. End quote. So Greg's a debater and a good one. Or at least he's good at making a positive impression on Christians, and that's what really counts in apologetics. Probably don't hurt that he was debating Deepak frickin' Chopra, of course. So what's his secret? Stroebel goes on to tell us, quote, he wasn't belligerent or obnoxious. He didn't raise his voice or launch into a sermon. Instead, he used the kind of tactics he describes in this book, winsomely using key questions and other techniques to guide the conversation and unveil the flawed assumptions and hidden contradictions in another person's positions. End quote. Already, I'm liking this book better than the last one. I mean, the last one was by Ray Comfort, so that's a low bar, but even so, I approve of this approach. Highly emotional confrontations is a serious obstacle to communication and persuasion, so the low-key, thought-provoking approach is already a big step up from your average megaphone-toting street preacher. I gotta confess, though, that I also approve of this approach because it plays into my own strategy for defeating Greg's tactics. For one thing, as a former Christian who was heavily into Bible study and evangelism, I know a thing or two about the flawed assumptions and hidden contradictions in Greg's positions. But more importantly, I've learned how not to ask questions in a conversation about religious convictions. And by questions, I don't mean simply requests for information like, hi, what's your name? Or would you like to discuss this over a cup of coffee? I'm talking about the strategy of using quote unquote key questions intended to guide the conversation and unveil the flawed assumptions and hidden contradictions in someone else's positions. Now, that can be an effective strategy in the hands of someone like Greg, but it's also vulnerable to the counter strategy that I plan to discuss in greater detail during the course of this series. The weakness of Greg's strategy is that he's teaching it to ordinary rank-and-file believers who's going to go out there and expect to have the same kind of success as Greg. And they ain't Greg. If they try to use the tactics that Greg's teaching them here and they don't work, that might start to cause them to have some doubts about Greg, and that in turn might just lead them to start questioning their whole faith. And I know that sounds simplistic, but there's an element of truth there. The way human psychology works, folks that's likely to believe Greg on account of his personality and tactics is also going to be potentially subject to irrational doubts if and anything undermines their trust in Greg. and that can play into our hands as counter-apologists. Well, back to Stroebel. He continues, quote, one of Greg's driving passions has been to train ordinary Christians in how they can use easy-to-understand tactics to dissect another person's worldview and to advance the case for Christianity. End quote. In other words, giving believers different scripts that they can use in different situations to maximize the effectiveness of their evangelism. Mormons do the same sort of thing when they train their young missionaries to go door to door. And it's interesting, ain't it? You'd think if they was an all-powerful deity who wanted a loving relationship with each of us, he wouldn't need no scripts. He'd just show up and say, hey, you want to catch a cup of coffee together? And, just hang out. But instead, we get smart folks like Greg figuring out which tricks work best to convince folks and then condensing them tricks down into a book of tactical scripts that other folks can use, just like the cults do. And I can't help but notice that this is exactly the sort of scenario you'd expect if God was just a myth and depended on human efforts to get folks converted. Stroebel goes on to warn us that, quote, we live in a day when militant atheism is on the march. Christianity is coming under attack, not just from best-selling books, skeptical college professors, television documentaries, but increasingly from neighbors and co-workers. End quote. And why do you suppose that might be? Do you think it might have something to do with the increasingly militant attacks by Christians on women's rights and women's bodies and the human rights of LGBT folks and other minorities? Or maybe their vocal support for outright fascist political candidates? But Lee don't ask why. All he cares about is recruiting ever-increasing numbers of folks to his own personal religion. And he thinks Greg Koukl has the right bag of tricks to make that happen. And that's it for Stroebel's foreword, so let's move on to the preface and hear from Greg himself. Quote, I want to start with a prediction, then I want to make a promise. Here's the prediction. If you read this book carefully and begin to practice the game plan I will teach you, you're going to begin to see remarkable changes in your ability to effectively maneuver in a relaxed and confident way in your conversations with others about Christ. End quote. So notice what the goal is here. We ain't talking to folks to learn more about them or get the benefit of their perspective. We ain't having open, honest conversations that might teach us something we didn't know. No, sir, we's maneuvering. We has a goal in mind, even if the other person don't know it. And we's going to be all smooth and suave so they don't suspect. They's going to just think that we has a friendly personality, and our agenda will remain safely hidden until we spot a vulnerability that we can exploit. Am I reading between the lines? I might just be reading between the lines. But then again, given Lee Stroebel's introduction, I don't think I'm inventing a whole lot here. This is a book about how to convert folks, and we'd best keep that in mind. Greg goes on to say that he's confident about his prediction because so many folks has tried his technique and got what Greg considers to be good results. And he's likely telling the truth here. There's a reason why Mormon missionaries is taught a bunch of pre-packaged scripts before they goes out door to door. It's an effective technique. And if you's going to go around preaching a God who don't actually exist, you's going to need the best techniques you can get your hands on. And there's a second benefit. If you get a hold of a good technique and you successfully convert folks with it, not only do you make new converts, you reinforce your own faith. In fact, a good technique can reinforce your faith even when you don't make a convert, because you can feel like you're planting a seed and doing good even when you don't see any immediate results. And I think that's also going to be a major focus of Greg's book. He continues, quote, and now the promise. I am going to give you a game plan that will allow you to converse with confidence in any situation, no matter how little you know or how knowledgeable or aggressive or even obnoxious the other person might be. End quote. And here's where the liability inherent in Greg's approach lifts up its head and winks at us. With the right approach and a good set of scripts, you can be successful even if you ain't right. Notice he says, no matter how little you know. Greg's approach don't depend on having informed, accurate answers. It's a maneuver, a trick, a way of exploiting common human weaknesses in order to manipulate other folks into becoming a convert. That ain't how an honest conversation works. If you want to be honest about convincing folks, you need to have done your homework and found accurate, verifiable answers that you can share and that they can verify. You can't just exploit psychology to fool folks into thinking you're just being a good friend. Okay, so back to Greg's tactics. We got us some maneuvers. Now, who's the target here? How are we going to identify what sorts of folks is going to be vulnerable to our bag of tricks? Greg's going to explain. Quote, before someone ever comes to Christ, there is always a period of time when they are thinking about the gospel, mulling it over, wondering whether it might be true. They may be putting out little probes by asking questions. They might even be fighting back a little bit. But still, they're wondering. End quote. So there's our mark. They's thinking about the gospel, but Greg kind of hints here that they don't actually know much about it. But the key point is they ain't made up their minds yet. Now, psychologists has found that the main reason folks convert to a religion, any religion, is for social reasons. Greg's approach is non-confrontational and non-argumentative. He uses the phrase planting a seed to talk about the believer saying less than they could and maybe a whole lot less than they'd like to. Greg would like to imply that by not being overly aggressive, the believer is giving the Holy Spirit time to work on the potential convert's heart. But what's actually going on is that they's given the potential convert time to build up positive social feelings towards the believer's in-group. Once the potential convert reaches the point where they want to be part of that in-group, they'll convert. And they'll justify it by claiming that some argument or other convinced them, or that they had some kind of supernatural conversion experience. But whatever rationalization they use, the real reason's going to be social, which is why you can't come along after the fact and use logic and evidence to get them to question their faith. Reason didn't get them into it, and so reason's going to have a hard time getting them out of it. Anyways, Greg's point here is that potential converts need some of what he calls pre-evangelism. And ain't that awesome? It gives believers an excuse to delay doing the outright evangelism while still feeling like they've taken steps to obey God's command to evangelize. Win-win. This sort of thing is why a lot of Christians really love Greg's approach. As I remember from my days as an evangelical Christian, you's always worried that you ain't doing enough to save souls. And that's really bad because all these folks is on their way to hell, and it's up to you to lead them to Christ so they can be saved. And that's likely to be socially awkward, so there's a lot of tension. But now here's Greg coming along, and he's got a way for you to start leading folks to Jesus without the social awkwardness. You don't evangelize, you pre-evangelize. And for a born-again, Bible-believing evangelical, that feels pretty good. It's like free brownie points. Awesome. Greg says that his approach is based on what Paul said in Colossians chapter 4, verses 5 through 6. And you can look that up if you like, but I'm more interested in what Greg thinks Paul is saying than in what Paul actually says, so let me just quote Greg. Quote, notice three elements in Paul's injunction. First, he says, be smart. Make the most of the moment, but watch your steps. Come in slowly, under the radar. Be shrewd, not blunt. End quote. So step one in Greg's method is to conceal your true intentions. Don't let the other person know that they's a target of your evangelical aspirations. Be disingenuous. Come in under the radar. Now that might sound just a teensy bit dishonest, but, well, that's because it is. You ain't having an open, honest conversation between equals here. You secretly setting yourself up to play the role of the evangelist, but you can't be open and honest about it because that might lead the other person to put their guard up. And according to Greg, this kind of hypocrisy should be your guiding principles in all your relationships. Ain't that something? Christians wonder why they get such a bad reputation, but this right here is a big part of the reason, at least if you're going to make a habit of it. Step 2, quote, next he says, be nice, show warmth, probe gently, be calm and patient. Remember, if anyone gets mad, you'll lose, end quote. And the important point, of course, is to win. This ain't just a friendly conversation. This is a contest, a struggle. The goal is not to lose. And how do you do that? By faking friendliness. Pretend you're genuinely interested in the other person. Put them at their ease in order to disarm their defenses. Don't let them know what you're really up to until it's too late. Again, this is fundamentally dishonest, as well as being a lousy basis for a relationship. This sets folks up for the all-too-common situation where your Christian friends suddenly lose interest as soon as you make it clear that you ain't got no intention of being a Christian. They never really cared about you. All they wanted was that extra notch on their Bible belt. And that's just sad. Step 3, quote, finally he says, be tactical, adjust to the individual, tailor your comments to his special situation. Each circumstance is different. Each person is unique. Treat them that way, end quote. And this one might actually be good advice if he weren't talking about coming up with customized tactics for maneuvering the other person into converting. Greg says to treat other folks as unique, but he don't say to respect their right to be unique. And he don't say to remember that not everybody has to think like you do or dress like you do or use the same vocabulary you use. And all that stuff is important, at least in honest relationships. But we ain't talking about honest relationships here. We's talking about trying to twist every innocent, harmless conversation into a psychological trick that's going to set up the other person for further manipulations in hopes of making converts out of them someday. And that's toxic. We got enough manipulative folks in the world already pursuing clandestine agendas. We don't need a bunch more Christians thinking God actually likes it when they're hypocritical in their friendships. Greg closes his preface with a reminder that you don't need to swing for the fences every time. And while it's nice that he's encouraging folks to stay away from high-pressure sales tactics, his low-key, under-the-radar approach is just as bad and more insidious to boot. So the lesson I want to take away from all this is for us non-believers not to be like Greg. We should adopt a strategy that's the exact opposite of what Greg's proposing here, especially when talking to evangelistically minded believers. We should be open and honest about our beliefs and be honest and friendly and respectful, not as part of some hidden agenda, but just on general principles, because we ain't secretly plotting to achieve some kind of goal beyond simple friendship. We's just being sincere. And there's one counter tactic in particular that I highly recommend, especially in conversations about religion. Don't ask questions. Or rather, don't ask questions designed to challenge the other person's beliefs. Instead, we should honestly state what we believe and why we believe it. For example, instead of asking, if God is good, why is there evil? We should just say, well, I don't think a perfect God would have created a corruptible world that was just going to end up full of sin and evil. And notice the difference here. We ain't putting the believer on the spot. We ain't suggesting or implying that the believer is stupid for believing in God. All we's doing is saying, this is what I find convincing. Now, the downside of this approach is that it requires some homework so that you actually have good reasons for what you believe, and that means deconstructing your atheism if you use an atheist. And, okay, maybe your reasons ain't all that intellectual nor complicated. Maybe God just seems irrelevant to you, and the gospel stories just don't strike you as plausible. And that's fine, just say so. You ain't arguing nor attacking the other person, you're just being honest. And that, to my mind, is a far superior approach. If you stick to it consistently, then you might even set a good enough example that the believer will throw Greg's duplicity out the window and start being honest with you themselves. And if you do have some really good answers, then use them. One of my goals for this channel is to provide folks with answers to questions that apologists likes to ask to catch folks off guard. Most apologetic questions has hidden assumptions, factual errors, or logical fallacies that they depend on, and the better you're able to identify those and give a counter-explanation, the easier it'll be to state your beliefs in a convincing and non-confrontational manner. And finally, we should remember that we don't need to convert nobody. It's enough just to keep ourselves unconverted. And I ain't saying that we shouldn't stand up and fight back when believers decide that God wants them to start being cruel to folks. If a belief starts spilling over into bad behavior, then it is time to take a stand against it. But belief all by itself is something we can classify under live and let live, so long as believers do the same. And I'm sure there's lots more that could be said, but that's going to do it for me for today. Next time we open up Chapter 1, entitled, quote, Diplomacy or D-Day, end quote. And personally, I vote for diplomacy, but it's always going to be a diplomacy based on actual verifiable facts. So we'll see how that goes. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.